Welcome back to Titanic Week here on the Hiking Historian. I'm Lucas Berry. Today we continue our look at the story of the most famous ship ever to sail by taking a look at some of the notable people on board. Let's get started at the very top, even higher than Captain Smith, chair of the White Star Line, Mr. J. Bruce Ismey. Mr. Ismey received harsh criticism after the sinking as he was the highest-ranking White Star Line officer to survive. He boarded collapsible lifeboat C, the last to leave the ship's starboard side. Perhaps this criticism is unfair, as some say he boarded the lifeboat only after seeing there were no women and children near as the lifeboat was being lowered. Thomas Andrews was considered a shipbuilding genius and oversaw the construction of the Olympic-class liners. He had wanted to make several changes to Titanic, including a double hull and having 48 lifeboats instead of the 20 she carried, but he was overruled. On the night of the disaster, Andrews was in his cabin planning changes to Titanic when the ship struck the iceberg. He did not feel the collision and was summoned by Captain Smith to assess the damage. He concluded the ship would sink and that she had about an hour before going under. Having made that conclusion, Andrews set about encouraging people to go up on deck and put on their life vests. He encouraged people to fill lifeboats, fully aware there were not enough for everyone. Andrews died that night a hero, trying to save as many lives as possible, while coming to grips with the fact that his work was sinking and he was going to die. Captain Smith was one of the most respected captains on the sea, and he was the man White Star Line trusted with taking Olympic and Titanic on their maiden voyages. The voyage on Titanic was to be his last before planned retirement. Unfortunately, he never made it back to his wife Sarah, instead going down with his ship. There are conflicting reports as to where Captain Smith was last seen. Some say he was on the bridge and died there when the bridge was swallowed by the sea. Some say he was the officer that committed suicide on deck as the ship went down, and some say he simply jumped into freezing water and died in that manner. We may never know what happened for sure to Captain Smith, but we do know his story is one of the most captivating associated with Titanic. Mr. Murak was the officer in charge when the ship struck the iceberg. There are some accounts that say Titanic was already turning to avoid the iceberg when the lookouts called the bridge. If that is in fact true, it would suggest that Murak was the first person to spot the iceberg and ordered the ship to turn in an attempt to avoid it. There are questions as to how Mr. Murak met his end, although we do know he died that night. Some say he was the officer who committed suicide, not Captain Smith. Other reports suggest he was helping to prepare a collapsible lifeboat and was swept into the sea. Mr. Lightoller was a very interesting fellow. On Titanic he was second officer and was the highest ranking officer to survive. He was in charge of the lifeboats on the port side and strictly adhered to the women and children first rule. In his civilian life, his most notable event is being part of the British evacuation at Dunkirk in World War II, personally sailing his motor yacht and bringing 127 men back to Britain. Fleet was the lookout who sighted the iceberg and rang the bell to alert the bridge. He would testify that had the lookouts had binoculars, they would have seen the iceberg in time to avoid it. He suffered severe depression and committed suicide in 1965. Jack Phillips was a very busy man on April 14th. The ship's Marconi machine had broken down the night before, and after Phillips and junior wireless operator Harold Bright stayed up all night fixing it, a massive stack of messages going out to Cape Race, Newfoundland from passengers had piled up on his desk. During this time, Titanic received messages of ice that were not reported to the bridge. The loudest of these messages was from the SS Californian, which reported she was stopped in ice. Phillips responded to that message, quote, "Keep out. Shut up. I'm working Cape Race." Close quote. It is worth noting that the Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, did not specify that this message should be delivered to the bridge. So as bad as it looks now, given what happened, Phillips did nothing wrong. Californian was the closest ship to Titanic, but she never heard the distress calls, as Evans had turned the radio off and gone to bed after the interaction with Titanic. Any other attempts to communicate between the two ships, such as using Morse lamps, were not successful. Had California gone to Titanic's aid, it's believed by some that she would have made it before Titanic sank and saved many lives. In 1992, the British government re-examined the case and determined that would not be the case. She simply would have been in the same spot as Carpathia, picking up survivors after Titanic had sank. There is great mystery surrounding Jack Phillips' death. Some say he was in collapsible lifeboat B and eventually died due to the cold, although there is much debate about if he ever was in lifeboat B. Known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, she boarded in Cherbourg. She had been traveling in France and booked a trip on Titanic as a way to get back to the United States after learning one of her grandchildren was ill. She assisted in the evacuation before boarding Lifeboat 6 herself. While on the lifeboat, she tried to convince Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to turn back for more survivors, but he refused, believing either the lifeboat would get sucked down or that survivors in the water would swarm the boat. Someone who really was unsinkable was Violet Jessup. She survived the sinking of Titanic and Britannic as well as the Olympus collision with the HMS Hawk. Pretty cool if you ask me. John Jager was the richest person aboard and was only aboard because his wife had become pregnant while traveling and wished to have the baby born in the United States. Initially, Mr. Astor seemed unfazed by the collision, but eventually helped his wife along with her maid and a nurse into Lifeboat 4. He asked if he could join them since it was a delicate situation, but Second Officer Lightoller told him no. He died that night, and his body was recovered on April 22nd. Isidore Strauss was the owner of Macy's department stores and briefly served in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was traveling with his wife Ida back to the U.S. on Titanic. Ida refused to leave Isidore once it became clear Titanic was in fact sinking, and she would not get into a lifeboat without him. The two were last seen on deck, arm in arm, and they both went down with the ship. What puts Dorothy Gibson on this list is the fact that she starred in the first motion picture about Titanic just weeks after the ship went down. It was called Saved from the Titanic and was released in May 1912. Thank you for joining us for this look at the people of Titanic. They are what makes this story so fascinating to me. Titanic is more than simply a ship that sank on her maiden voyage. She is a collection of 2,200 souls brought together on one ship, whose stories are forever linked. 1,496 of those souls never lived to tell their stories. It is up to us, the people living, to tell them. It is up to us to keep their stories alive. Same goes for those who survived that night but are gone now. That's what we're trying to do here. Tell the stories of this ship, because it is truly one of the most captivating collection of stories ever told. For liking historian, I'm Lucas Berry. Join us tomorrow as we recall the voyage of the RMS Titanic.